Lieutenant Commander James Hale stood in the formal reception hall of the Valkren Imperial Palace, feeling slightly out of place despite 6 months of diplomatic assignment. The hall was magnificent, soaring ceilings painted with historical scenes, spanning millennia, crystalline chandeliers that refracted light in patterns creating moving art on the walls, and hundreds of guests representing various Valkren noble houses and allied species. James was here as military liaison between humanity and the Valkren Empire, a role that involved more formal functions and cultural exchange than actual military work. It was prestigious but relatively ceremonial, coordinating joint exercises, attending diplomatic events, learning Valkren protocol and customs. Tonight's reception celebrated the anniversary of the Human-Valkren Alliance. 5 years of peaceful cooperation, trade agreements, cultural exchange. James wore his dress uniform and made polite conversation with various dignitaries, his translation implant rendering the musical Valkren language into comprehensible standard. The Valkren were striking, humanoid with distinctive long ears that denoted lineage and status through various ornaments and piercings. Naturally graceful movements evolved from persistent hunting ancestors, and a culture built on honor, tradition, and rigid hierarchical structures that made even the most formal human societies seem casual by comparison. Their Empress, Selyria, ruled with authority that was considered absolute and semi-divine by her people. James had met her briefly during diplomatic functions. She was impressive, intelligent, composed, carrying herself with the kind of presence that made it impossible to forget she was royalty. Tall even by Valkren standards, with amber eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and an aura of controlled power that both commanded respect and maintained careful distance. The evening was proceeding routinely, pleasant conversations, excellent food, the kind of diplomatic theater that James had learned to navigate competently if not enthusiastically, when everything went catastrophically wrong. Explosions tore through the palace's eastern wing. The sounds were distant but unmistakable, deliberate, coordinated, powerful. Not accidents, attacks. Alarms began screaming through the palace, and security protocols that should have activated instantly didn't. Blast doors that should have sealed sections remained open. Emergency shields that should have deployed stayed inactive. Someone had sabotaged the systems. Within seconds, the reception descended from elegant diplomatic function into absolute chaos. Armed attackers poured through entrances that should have been secure, wearing palace security uniforms, but moving with coordinated precision that spoke of military training. James saw palace guards fighting each other, some protecting guests, others clearly part of whatever conspiracy this was. This was a coup attempt, organized, well-planned, with inside assistance at the highest levels. James's combat training took over immediately, cutting through the shock and confusion. He wasn't armed, ceremonial functions didn't allow weapons, but he was trained for crisis response and had seen combat in his previous postings before this diplomatic assignment. He moved toward the nearest defensible position, helping panicked guests reach cover behind overturned tables and decorative pillars, trying to assess the situation and organize some kind of response. The attackers were focusing on specific targets, members of the imperial family, high-ranking officials, anyone who could maintain continuity of government if the Empress fell. Then James saw her. Empress Selyria, separated from her primary security detail and cornered near the hall's far exit by 3 attackers wearing palace security uniforms. She was fighting. Valkren royalty were trained warriors from childhood, but she was outnumbered and already wounded, blood staining her elaborate formal robes from a gash along her ribs. James didn't think, didn't calculate odds or consider consequences. He just moved. He grabbed a ceremonial blade from a fallen guard, ornate but functional, sharp despite its decorative purpose, and threw himself into the fight. He wasn't as naturally strong as Valkren, whose evolution on a higher gravity world had made them physically powerful. But human combat training emphasized efficiency, adaptability, and exploiting openings rather than relying on raw strength. Surprise gave him crucial advantage. The attackers weren't expecting a human diplomat to engage, and that split second of confusion let James get inside one attacker's guard and deliver a strike to the throat that sent him down gasping. The second attacker turned toward this unexpected threat, and that gave Selyria the opening she needed to dispatch the third with a precise strike. Now it was 2 against 2, and James fought with focused intensity born of years of training and multiple combat deployments. He took down the second attacker with a blade thrust to the shoulder, followed by a strike that rendered him unconscious. "Your Majesty, we need to move now," James said, already scanning for escape routes. The main corridors would be compromised. This attack was too coordinated. "Do you know alternate routes out of the palace?" Selyria's amber eyes focused on him with shocking intensity, taking in his face, his uniform, recognizing him from previous diplomatic functions. "My family, my advisors, are either being protected by loyal guards or they're already dead," James interrupted with brutal honesty he immediately regretted but knew was necessary. "Right now, we keep you alive. You're the primary target. If you die, the coup succeeds. Where's the emergency evacuation route?" Selyria made her decision in less than a second. The ability to make critical choices under pressure was why she was Empress. "Follow me." They moved through the chaos, Selyria leading them through servant corridors and maintenance passages that few people knew existed. Behind them, they heard fighting, explosions, the sounds of the palace tearing itself apart. Selyria was limping. The wound in her side was worse than James had initially thought, bleeding steadily despite the pressure she was applying. But she pushed forward with determined focus, refusing to slow down even as her face grew pale from blood loss. They were almost to what Selyria indicated was an emergency exit when they encountered another group of attackers, 5 of them, blocking the corridor ahead. "Behind me, Your Majesty," James said, moving to put himself between Selyria and the threat. This fight was desperate and brutal. James was outnumbered, armed only with a ceremonial blade, protecting someone who was already wounded. But he fought with everything he had, every technique, every dirty trick, every bit of combat experience from deployments where failure meant death. He took multiple hits. A blade slashed across his ribs, cutting deep. An impact to his head made his vision blur and darken at the edges. His left arm took damage that made it nearly useless. But they broke through. Selyria dispatched 2 of the attackers while James held off the others, and they made it to the emergency exit, a concealed door that led to the palace's maintenance sublevel. The door sealed behind them, buying precious time. They moved through darkness, Selyria guiding because she knew the layout even in blackout conditions, James supporting her when she stumbled, both of them leaving blood trails as they pushed deeper into the tunnels. The maintenance sublevel connected to old service tunnels that led beyond the palace grounds. Emergency evacuation, routes installed centuries ago, and maintained out of tradition more than expectation they'd ever be needed. They emerged in the lower city as dawn broke. Behind them, the Imperial Palace was burning, multiple sections sending thick black smoke into the morning sky, visible explosions still rocking the structure. "We need to reach the military garrison," Selyria said, her voice steady despite obvious pain and exhaustion. "Loyalist forces will rally there. I can take command, organize response." They moved through streets that were beginning to show panic as news of the attack spread, people running, shouting, confusion and fear spreading like wildfire. James was supporting most of Selyria's weight now. She was fading from blood loss and exhaustion, each step requiring visible effort. His own injuries were screaming at him, his vision swimming, but adrenaline kept him functional. They were 2 blocks from the garrison when Selyria collapsed completely. "Your Majesty," James caught her before she hit the ground, checked her wound. It was bad. She'd lost too much blood, needed immediate medical attention. He could hear pursuit behind them, shouts, running footsteps. The attackers hadn't given up. They knew if Selyria reached Loyalist forces, the coup would fail. James made his decision without hesitation. He picked up Selyria. She was taller than most human women but lighter than expected. Valkren bone structure adapted for higher gravity, making them dense but not heavy, and ran the remaining distance to the garrison. He was screaming for help, for medics, for anyone loyal to the Empress. His vision was tunneling, his injuries making each step agony, but he pushed through on pure determination. The garrison gates were opening, guards rushing forward with weapons ready, and James nearly sobbed with relief. "Empress Selyria," he gasped out, "wounded, needs immediate medical attention." Palace compromised, coup attempt. The garrison erupted into controlled chaos. Medics rushed forward, taking Selyria's unconscious form from his arms. Security surrounded them, forming protective perimeter. Officers were shouting orders, organizing response. James finally let himself stop, let the adrenaline fade. That's when he realized how badly he was injured. The blade wound across his ribs was deep, bleeding heavily. His head was bleeding from the impact, vision swimming and doubling. His left arm hung useless, something damaged internally. He was covered in blood, his and Selyria's both. He heard someone calling for medical assistance as his legs gave out and he collapsed. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Selyria being carried toward the medical bay on a stretcher, medics working frantically. At least she's safe, he thought as consciousness faded. At least I did that right. At least she'll survive. Consciousness returned in fragments. Pain first, sharp, persistent pain in his ribs, throbbing agony in his head, a dull ache throughout his entire body. Then sensation, soft bedding beneath him, the hum of medical equipment, the familiar antiseptic smell of a medical facility. Then awareness. He was in a hospital bed, probably the garrison's medical bay. Still alive somehow. The mission had been successful. Get the Empress to safety. Keep her alive long enough for Loyalist forces to organize. James opened his eyes slowly, expecting to see doctors or nurses or maybe a debriefing officer ready to take his statement about what had happened. Instead, he was shocked to see Empress Selyria sitting in a chair beside his bed. She was cleaned up from the chaos of the coup attempt, no longer covered in blood and dirt. She wore simple robes instead of formal imperial attire, practical and comfortable. Her wound was bandaged. He could see the dressing peeking out from beneath the robes, and she looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept much. But she was alive and alert, watching him with those intense amber eyes. "Your Majesty," James tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his ribs like fire. "Please don't move," Selyria said, her hand gently but firmly pressing him back down against the pillows. "Your injuries are significant. The blade wound required extensive surgical treatment, and you have a severe concussion. The doctors insist you remain still for at least another day." "You should be," James stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "You should be organizing your empire, dealing with the coup aftermath, not sitting beside a wounded human's bedside." "I should be exactly where I am," Selyria said with quiet intensity. "You saved my life, Commander Hale, multiple times throughout that terrible night. You fought for me when you had no obligation to do so, protected me when you could have fled to safety, carried me to the garrison despite your own grave injuries. That creates obligation that I must honor." "Just doing my job, Your Majesty." "Your job is military liaison and cultural exchange," Selyria said, and there was unexpected emotion in her voice. She'd always been so controlled during diplomatic functions. "Your job does not include throwing yourself into combat to protect me, fighting through palace corridors against impossible odds, or carrying a wounded empress through hostile streets while bleeding from multiple wounds." She leaned forward slightly. "You went far beyond duty, Commander. You risked your life for mine without hesitation or expectation of reward. Among my people, that creates sacred obligation that must be properly honored. Your Majesty, please, you have an empire to manage. There was a coup attempt. You need to be consolidating power, organizing loyalist forces, dealing with the conspirators. My advisors and loyal military commanders are handling the immediate crisis under my direction. Selyria interrupted firmly. The conspiracy was crushed within hours once we reached the garrison, and I could coordinate response. The conspirators underestimated how quickly my people would rally once they knew I was alive and giving orders. Then you especially shouldn't be here wasting time. Commander Hale, Selyria said, and there was steel in her voice now, the voice of an empress not accustomed to being argued with or questioned. Among the Valkren, when someone saves your life at genuine risk to their own, certain obligations are created. Sacred obligations that must be honored properly. You stayed beside me throughout that terrible night, protecting me even as you were wounded. Now I will stay beside you until I am certain of your recovery. This is not negotiable. James didn't know what to say to that. Over the following days, he learned that Selyria was absolutely serious about her intention. She remained by his bedside during his recovery, leaving only for the most critical imperial business, making necessary decisions, issuing essential orders, showing her face to reassure her people she was alive and in command, and returning as soon as possible. Her advisors were clearly uncomfortable with this arrangement. They came regularly to deliver reports and updates, and barely hid their shock at finding their empress personally tending a wounded human. Your Majesty, this is unprecedented, one elderly advisor said carefully during a briefing on the fourth day. You have attendants and medical staff who could watch over Commander Hale's recovery. Your personal presence here is not necessary and sends complicated messages to your people. The message I am sending is clear and intentional, Selyria said, without looking away from adjusting James's bandages with surprising gentleness. Commander Hale saved my life. He stayed beside me when he could have fled to safety. He protected me at cost to himself. I will honor that by remaining beside him until he is fully recovered. If anyone in my court finds this confusing, they are welcome to study our histories on sacred obligations and life debts. The advisor looked like he wanted to argue further but wisely retreated, recognizing a losing battle when he saw one. After he left, James said carefully, Your Majesty, I'm starting to sense that your staying here is causing political complications. My staying here is honoring an obligation that my people understand even if they find it uncomfortable in this specific context, Selyria corrected. But yes, it is unusual for an empress to personally tend someone's recovery. Typically, that role would fall to attendants or family members. I have colleagues who could sit with me. You saved my life multiple times while wounded and bleeding, Selyria interrupted. You earned my personal attention, not delegation to attendants. This is my choice, Commander, and I will not be moved on it. James was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been bothering him. Among your people, what exactly does this mean? You staying beside me during recovery. Selyria was also quiet, and when she spoke, her voice carried unusual weight and what might have been vulnerability. Among the Valkren, remaining beside someone during their recovery from wounds sustained protecting you is deeply significant. It is acknowledgement of profound debt and indication of personal investment beyond mere obligation or gratitude. It is what one does for family, or for those one has chosen to be bound to in ways that transcend formal relationships. Chosen to be bound to, James repeated carefully, sensing he was touching on something culturally important. It is complicated, Selyria admitted, and he thought he detected something like nervousness in her voice, shocking from someone usually so perfectly controlled. There are cultural nuances that do not translate easily into human understanding. But you should know, my remaining beside you like this is public declaration to my people that I value you beyond your utility as military liaison or political necessity. It is personal statement about connection and obligation that my people will interpret as extremely significant. She met his gaze directly. They will see it as indication that I consider you bound to me in ways that matter deeply. That what happened between us during that night created connection. I am choosing to honor and acknowledge publicly. James felt the weight of that settle over him like a physical thing. He was beginning to understand that what seemed like simple gratitude or proper acknowledgement carried far deeper meaning in Valkren culture. That Selyria's vigil beside his bed was being interpreted by her people as some kind of declaration, and that by saving the Empress on the night of the massacre, he'd bound their fates together in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. A week after the coup attempt, James was recovering well enough to sit up comfortably and take short walks around the medical bay with assistants. The blade wound was healing cleanly, his concussion symptoms were fading, and the doctors were optimistic about full recovery. Selyria continued her vigil, and the whispers were getting louder. James overheard conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. Between medical staff, between guards posted outside his room, between the various officials who came to deliver reports to Selyria. Everyone was talking about what the Empress's behavior meant. She hasn't left his side, one guard whispered to another during a shift change, not realizing James was awake and could hear them from his bed. Only for the most critical business, and even then she returns immediately. That level of personal devotion, it hasn't happened since. Since her husband died, the other guard interrupted quietly, 10 years ago. She sat vigil beside Emperor Thuron for 3 days before he passed from his wounds, refused to leave, tended him personally, stayed until the end. She hasn't shown that level of personal commitment to anyone since, until now. With a human, the implications hit James like a physical blow. He'd known Selyria was widowed. It was in the basic diplomatic briefing materials all liaisons received. Emperor Thuron had been killed in an accident 10 years ago, leaving Selyria to rule alone. But James hadn't understood what her current behavior meant in that context. She was showing devotion that her people hadn't seen in a decade. Devotion she'd last shown to her deceased husband. The comparison was deliberate. She had to know what message she was sending. "Your Majesty," James said that evening when she returned from a brief meeting, "we need to talk about what people are saying." "People say many things," Selyria replied calmly, settling into her chair. "Which particular whispers concern you?" "The comparisons they're making, between how you're treating me and how you—" He hesitated. "How you stayed beside your husband before he died." Selyria was very still for a moment. "I see the guards have been less discreet than I would prefer." "Is it true?" "Yes," she said simply. "When Thuron was dying, I remained beside him for 3 days. I refused to leave, tended him personally, stayed until he passed. It was—" She paused. When Selyria returned from her meeting with military commanders later that afternoon, James decided they needed to talk honestly about what was happening. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss what's going on here. You are recovering from significant injuries sustained while protecting me," Selyria said calmly, settling into her customary chair beside his bed. "What is there to discuss?" "The political implications of your personal vigil. The messages you're sending to your people, the comparisons everyone is making too." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "To how you behaved after your husband died." Selyria went very still, her amber eyes fixing on him with sharp intensity. "You have heard the whispers. It's hard not to. Your people are talking. Guards, medical staff, advisors, they're all interpreting your behavior as significant, more significant than gratitude for being saved." "It is significant," Selyria said quietly, and for the first time she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "Commander Hale, James among my people, choosing to remain beside someone during their recovery, to personally tend their wounds and refuse to leave their side, is not merely gratitude or obligation. It is declaration of personal bond and profound investment. It is what one does for family, for chosen companions, for. She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. For those one considers bound to oneself by choice, rather than formal obligation or political necessity. James's chest tightened. Your Majesty, I don't understand what you're saying. Selyria moved her chair closer, and he saw real emotion in her usually controlled expression, vulnerability, uncertainty, but also determination. I am saying that you saved my life while risking your own, that you stayed beside me throughout that terrible night, protecting me even as you bled, that you carried me to safety when you could barely stand yourself, refusing to leave me even when doing so would have been logical for your own survival. Such actions create bond that transcends political alliance or military duty. She took a breath. I am saying that by remaining at your side, by refusing to leave you alone during your recovery, I am making public declaration to my people that you matter to me personally, that I am bound to you by more than gratitude or political necessity, that in the eyes of my court, I have chosen you as someone worthy of devotion that I have not shown to anyone since my husband's death. James felt like he couldn't breathe properly. Your Majesty, you can't mean. I am Empress. I say exactly what I mean and nothing less. She held his gaze with fierce intensity. James, that night in the palace when everything fell apart and death was certain, you chose to protect me. Not from duty or political calculation, but because it was right. You stayed with me when you could have fled. You fought for me when you had no obligation. You honored me with your courage and your loyalty and your willingness to sacrifice yourself. And now I am honoring you the same way, she continued, her voice carrying absolute conviction. By staying beside you, by refusing to leave while you recover, I am showing my people that you matter to me beyond your role or position, that the bond created that night is real and personal, that I choose to be bound to you if you will accept such bond. I'm human, James said, his voice rough with emotion and shock. I'm a military liaison with no political significance. I'm not royal or high-ranking or. You are the man who saved my life, Selyria interrupted firmly. You are brave and genuine and honorable. You are someone I choose to bind myself to, regardless of species or rank or political calculation. The question is whether you choose the same. James stared at her, trying to process what she was actually offering. This was the Empress of the Valkren Empire essentially proposing some kind of bond, and from everything she'd said and the whispers he'd heard, a bond that her people would interpret as profound personal commitment, comparable in significance to what she'd had with her late husband. Your Majesty, Selyria, I don't know your customs well enough to understand fully what I'm accepting or what it would mean. You are accepting that we are bound together by what happened that night, Selyria explained patiently, clearly relieved he was at least considering rather than immediately refusing. That the loyalty shown in blood creates connection that transcends political alliance or formal relationships. That I will stand beside you as you stood beside me, and that this bond is acknowledged publicly before my people. She leaned forward. Among the Valkren, such bonds are sacred. They cannot be broken except through death or mutual agreement to dissolve them. By accepting, you would be bound to me and I to you, in ways that my people will recognize as profound commitment beyond mere friendship or professional alliance. You would have standing in my court, protection under my personal authority, and connection to me that would be permanent unless we both chose otherwise. What if we're incompatible? James asked. What if we discover we can't actually build whatever this is? Then we work through difficulties because the bond is sacred and not easily set aside, Selyria said. But James, I have spent this past week beside you. I have seen how you treat medical staff with respect regardless of rank, how you worry about the burden your presence places on others, how you maintain your humor and kindness despite pain. I have had time to observe who you are beyond that night of crisis, and everything I see suggests you are someone worth binding myself to. What happens if I refuse? James asked, needing to understand all options. Pain flashed across Selyria's face. Then I will respect your decision absolutely. But the bond I feel, the connection created that night, would not disappear. I would simply honor it privately rather than publicly. You would remain under my protection, but without formal acknowledgement of the connection. And she paused. I would accept that you do not wish to be bound to me in return, though it would cause me significant pain. James thought about that night, the chaos, the violence, the absolute certainty he'd felt that protecting Selyria was the right thing to do. Not from duty but from something deeper, something instinctive that had transcended rational calculation. He thought about the past week, watching Selyria refuse to leave his side despite obvious political pressure. The way she'd tended his wounds with her own hands despite having attendants. The vulnerability she'd shown that he suspected few people ever saw. He thought about the whispers, the political implications, the fact that he was being offered something that would permanently change his life and bind him to an empress in ways he still didn't fully understand. And despite all the logical reasons to refuse, to maintain professional boundaries, to avoid complications, he found himself saying, "I accept." Selyria's relief was immediate and profound. Tears formed in her amber eyes, the first real emotional breakdown of her legendary composure that James had witnessed. "Truly," she asked, her voice thick with emotion, "you are certain? You understand what this means? That we would be bound, that the connection would be sacred and permanent, that my people would view you as someone under my personal protection and favor in ways that carry enormous political weight." "I'm terrified," James admitted honestly. "I don't fully understand what I'm accepting or what it will mean for my life, but I understand enough to know that you're offering something real and important. That what happened between us that night created something worth acknowledging and honoring, and that you've shown me more genuine connection and care in this past week than most people show in years." He met her gaze directly. "So yes, I accept the bond. I accept being bound to you. Whatever that means, we'll figure it out together." "Then we are bound," Selyria said quietly, reverently, as if speaking sacred vows. "By blood spilled in loyalty, by choice made freely in peace. What was created in violence and devotion is now acknowledged and honored. We are connected, and what was forged in that terrible night is now made permanent." She reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd done so, and James felt the weight of the moment, the significance of what they'd just committed to. He didn't fully understand it yet, didn't know all the implications or how it would change his life. But he understood enough to know that this was real, sacred, and would bind them together in ways that neither could fully predict, but both were choosing to honor. The bond was acknowledged between them, and there was no going back. Over the following days, as James continued to recover, the reality of what they'd agreed to began to settle in. Selyria explained more about what the bond meant in Valkren culture, how it would be formalized through public ceremony, what standing it would give him in her court, what obligations and protections it carried. "There will be political opposition," she warned him. "Some of my nobles will see this as inappropriate elevation of an outsider. Others will view it as dangerous precedent. A human and chosen bond with the Empress is unprecedented in our entire history." "Are you sure you want to face that opposition?" James asked. "For me, I would face far more than political opposition for you," Selyria said firmly. "You saved my life, James. You honored me with loyalty and courage. I will not diminish that by refusing to acknowledge it properly simply because it's politically inconvenient. What about your people? Will they accept this?" "Some will, some won't," Selyria said pragmatically. "But ultimately I am Empress. My word is law, and I have chosen to bind myself to you. That is my right and my decision." She paused. "Besides, you earned this through your actions. Not through birth or political maneuvering, but through genuine courage and honor. That is worth more than any noble bloodline." James absorbed that, still trying to fully process the magnitude of what was happening. "When will the formal ceremony be?" he asked. "When you are fully recovered," Selyria said. "The doctors say another 2 weeks before you're ready for extended public appearances. We'll hold the ceremony then before the full court. It will be significant. I don't know your protocols well enough." "I will teach you everything you need to know," Selyria assured him. "The ceremony itself is relatively simple. We declare the bond before witnesses, you accept it formally, and it becomes legally and culturally binding. The complexity comes from what it represents, not from the ritual itself." As the days passed and James grew stronger, Selyria began preparing him for what was to come. She explained the ceremony's components, taught him the proper Valkren phrases he would need to speak, helped him understand the political landscape he was about to enter. And through it all, James found himself increasingly certain that accepting the bond had been the right choice. Not because he fully understood it, not because it was politically smart or career-advancing, but because when he looked at Selyria, this empress who'd chosen to bind herself to him, who'd stayed beside him when she had an empire to run, who showed him vulnerability that few others ever saw, he knew that what they were building was genuine. The bond was real, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The formal ceremony acknowledging their bond happened 3 weeks later, after James had recovered enough to participate in public proceedings without risking his health. His injuries were healed sufficiently to stand for extended periods, though he still experienced residual pain and would carry scars, both the visible one across his ribs and others that were less obvious. The doctors had cleared him for limited activity, though they'd insisted he continue taking things slowly. Selyria was careful to explain what the ceremony would involve and what it would mean to her people. "Among the Valkren, there are many forms of bond," she said during one of their private conversations in the days leading up to the ceremony. They were in her personal study, now rather than the medical bay. James had finally been discharged, sitting across from each other with cups of Valkren tea that James was learning to appreciate. "Marriage is one form," Selyria continued. "Formal legal alliance, often arranged for political benefit, creating new family connections and consolidating power. It's practical and structured, with clearly defined obligations and expectations. But there are others," she said. "Warrior bonds between those who have fought and bled together, family bonds that transcend biology, and chosen bonds, connections formed through shared experience and mutual decision to remain connected despite having no formal obligation to do so. What we are formalizing is chosen bond forged in blood," Selyria explained, watching his face carefully to ensure he understood. "It acknowledges that you saved my life, and I choose to bind myself to you in response. It gives you formal standing within my court and protection under my direct personal authority. It declares publicly that you are under my favor, and that our connection is recognized and sacred. It will also cause significant political complications," James pointed out pragmatically. "I am fully aware," Selyria said with a slight smile. "My advisors have been extremely vocal about their concerns. A human in chosen bond with the Empress is unprecedented in our entire recorded history. Some see it as properly honoring appropriate obligation. Others see it as dangerous precedent that undermines traditional power structures and opens doors to outsiders that should remain closed. Are you sure you want to do this? The political cost." "I have never been more certain of anything," Selyria interrupted with absolute conviction. "You saved my life, James. You stayed beside me when death was certain. You honored me with loyalty and courage that I have not received from many of my own nobles who claim to serve me. I will acknowledge that publicly and formally, regardless of political convenience or traditional expectations." The ceremony was held in the Grand Hall, the same magnificent space where the reception had been held before the coup attempt, now fully repaired and restored. The damage had been erased, but everyone who'd been there that night would forever carry memories of what had happened. Hundreds of Valkren nobles and high officials filled the hall, along with representatives from allied species, including several from Earth. The human ambassador was present, looking uncertain about what exactly was happening but supportive of James. Selyria wore full imperial regalia, elaborate robes that combined practical armor with symbolic decoration, her long ears adorned with the traditional ornaments of imperial authority. She looked every bit the absolute ruler of a powerful empire. James wore his formal military uniform, feeling somewhat underdressed compared to the Valkren nobility, but representing his own people with as much dignity as he could muster. The ceremony began with traditional Valkren elements, formal acknowledgments, ritual phrases in the ancient dialect that James's implant translated, but that carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Then Selyria spoke, her voice carrying through the vast hall with absolute authority. "Commander James Hale of humanity saved my life during the coup attempt," she announced. "When our palace fell to treachery and violence, when death seemed certain and all was chaos, he chose to protect me. He fought for me when he had no obligation to do so. He stayed beside me when he could have fled to safety. He carried me to the garrison despite his own grave wounds, refusing to leave me even when doing so would have ensured his own survival." She turned to face James directly, and he saw the intensity in her eyes. This was deeply personal, not just political theater. "Such loyalty and courage create obligation that must be honored," Selyria continued, her voice carrying clear emotion now. "I declare before my people and my ancestors that Commander Hale is bound to me by choice and by blood spilled in loyalty. He is under my personal protection and favor, elevated to my court with standing that acknowledges what he has done. The bond between us is sacred and publicly recognized. From this day forward we are connected, and what threatens one threatens both. What honors one honors both. We are bound." The formal words in Valkren carried layers of meaning that the translation couldn't fully capture. Implications about the nature of their connection, the permanence of it, the sacred obligations it created for both of them. James responded with the phrases Selyria had carefully taught him over the past weeks, speaking in Valkren to show respect for the ceremony's cultural significance. "I accept the bond offered in honor and gratitude," James said, feeling the weight of every word. "I acknowledge the connection created through shared danger, shared survival, and mutual choice to remain bound. I accept the standing offered and the responsibility it carries. What was born in violence and loyalty is now honored in peace. I am bound, and I accept that binding willingly." The court witnessed in profound silence. James could feel hundreds of eyes on him, could sense the mixture of emotions: shock, curiosity, judgment, approval, disapproval, fascination. Some were supportive, those who'd witnessed what happened during the coup, who understood the cultural obligation, who respected Selyria's decision to honor it publicly. Others were hostile, nobles who saw a human being elevated through chosen bond as disruption to traditional hierarchies, as dangerous precedent that suggested outsiders could gain standing through action rather than birth, as threat to the careful balance of power they'd spent years cultivating. When the ceremony concluded, the political reality set in quickly. James's life transformed overnight. He was no longer just a military liaison attending diplomatic functions. He had formal standing in the imperial court, protected by Selyria's personal favor, but also subject to political maneuvering from various factions who saw him as either opportunity or threat. He received invitations from nobles seeking his favor and potential influence with the Empress. Some were sincere, wanting to know more about the human who'd saved their ruler. Others were clearly calculating, trying to determine how to use this new situation to their advantage. He faced subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hostility from nobles who resented his elevation. Challenges to his authority, questions about his qualifications, carefully worded insults designed to remind him he was an outsider who didn't truly belong in their world. He had to learn complex court protocols that made diplomatic etiquette seem simple by comparison. There were rules about who could speak to whom and when, about positioning during formal events, about appropriate responses to various forms of address, about navigating the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that defined Valkren nobility. James made mistakes, inevitable when learning an entirely new cultural system. He offended people accidentally, missed subtle cues, misinterpreted gestures and phrases that seemed simple but carried hidden meanings. But through it all, Selyria remained constant. She meant what she'd said about the bond being real and personal. When James was uncertain about protocol, she guided him patiently without making him feel incompetent. When nobles attempted to undermine or manipulate him, she protected him without hesitation, making clear that attacks on him would be taken as personal affronts to her. When he questioned whether he truly belonged in this world of imperial politics and ancient traditions, she reminded him why she'd chosen to bind herself to him. "You stayed beside me when death was certain," she told him during a private moment months after the ceremony, when he was expressing doubts about his place in her court. They were in the palace gardens, walking among plants that had been cultivated for thousands of years. "You asked for nothing in return, expected nothing. You simply did what was right because that is who you are. That integrity is worth more than any political alliance or strategic advantage." "I just did what anyone would do," James said, still uncomfortable with being treated as someone special. "No," Selyria corrected gently but firmly. "You did what you would do. Many others fled that night, seeking their own safety. You chose differently. That choice bound us together, and I do not regret honoring it. Not for a single moment, despite all the political complications it has created." "Does it bother you?" James asked. "The pushback from your nobles, the questions about whether this was appropriate." "My people question many of my decisions," Selyria said philosophically. "That is the nature of rule. But this decision, binding myself to you, this one I would defend against any challenge. You have proven yourself worthy of the bond through your actions both during the coup and in the months since. You carry yourself with dignity while remaining genuine. You learn from mistakes without letting them destroy your confidence. You are exactly who I believed you to be when I chose to remain beside you." Years passed. James became integrated into Valkren court life, while maintaining his identity as human and his connections to Earth. He learned to navigate the political complexities, to understand the cultural nuances, to build genuine relationships with some nobles while maintaining appropriate distance from others. The bond with Selyria deepened in ways that were difficult to categorize by either human or Valkren standards. It wasn't romantic in the traditional human sense, though there was deep affection and intimacy of a sort. The intimacy of shared trauma, shared survival, mutual choice to remain connected despite complications. It wasn't purely political, though it had profound political implications and changed how other nations viewed both the Valkren Empire and humanity's relationship with it. It was something else, a connection forged in crisis and acknowledged through mutual choice, creating partnership that transcended simple categories. They were bound together by what had happened that terrible night, by the choice each had made to honor the connection, by years of standing beside each other through political challenges and personal struggles. 5 years after the night of the massacre, James and Selyria stood together in the palace gardens during sunset, a routine they'd developed, taking time away from court politics to simply exist as two people rather than empress and bonded companion. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, watching the way the setting sun painted the sky in colors that had no names in either of their languages. The political complications, the precedent it set, the disruption to traditional structures. "Never," Selyria said without hesitation. "You saved my life, James. You honored me with loyalty and courage when I most needed it. Acknowledging that bond, making it public and permanent, was one of the best decisions of my reign. Regardless of political cost. I thought I'd just be a military liaison, James said with a slight smile. Attending diplomatic functions, coordinating exercises, maybe writing a few reports. Instead, I ended up bound to an empress through sacred chosen bond that her people still debate the implications of 5 years later. Life rarely follows the path we anticipate, Selyria observed. But sometimes the unexpected paths lead to something more valuable than what we'd planned. You stayed beside me that night. I stayed beside you during your recovery. We chose to bind ourselves together formally. And from that, we built something genuine, partnership that matters beyond political calculation or strategic advantage. I don't regret it either, James said quietly. Any of it, even the complicated parts. Even the mistakes I made learning your culture. Even the nobles who still look at me like I'm an interloper who doesn't belong. You do belong, Selyria said firmly. You earned your place through courage and honor, through staying when others fled, through accepting a bond you didn't fully understand because it felt right. That is more legitimate than any claim based purely on birth or political connection. The bond is permanent, you know, she added with a slight smile. By our law and custom, it cannot be dissolved except through death or mutual agreement, and I have no intention of agreeing to dissolution. Good, James replied, because I wouldn't accept it even if you offered. We're bound, Selyria, for better or worse, and I choose to honor that binding. As do I, Selyria said, as I will continue to do for however long we both live. When historians later wrote about the coup attempt and its aftermath, they focused on the military response, the political ramifications, the restructuring of power that followed, the lessons learned about security and loyalty. But those who were there, who understood what had really happened between an empress and a human on that terrible night, knew a different story. The story of loyalty shown in blood creating obligation that transcended politics. The story of an empress who defied tradition and political calculation to honor a human who'd saved her life, refusing to leave his side during recovery, and making public declaration of bond that shocked her entire court. The story of a human who accepted a connection he didn't fully understand because it felt right, who stayed beside the empress not from duty, but from genuine choice. The story of a bond created in violence and acknowledged in peace, deepened through years of standing beside each other, proving that sometimes the most powerful connections are the ones formed in crisis and honored through mutual devotion. The night James saved the empress, and she never left his side while he was wounded. The declaration she made through her actions that loyalty in blood creates obligation that transcends crowns, politics, and destiny itself. The bond they built, not quite marriage, not quite political alliance, but something deeper and more genuine than either.